late 1700s, early 1800s, it became more commonplace for people to go travelling. And with that came this whole slew of travel writing and poetry writing from a romanticist movement. And then the trolls came. Hi, my name is Hannah, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Gothic fiction. Not just what Gothic fiction is, but some entry-level Gothic fiction books. If you would like to start picking up more Gothic books, but you've been intimidated or you're worried they're going to be too spooky for you, too much, too complex, etc. So essentially, early 1800s, like I said, Romanticism movement in full swing. This little politician's son, little dickhead called Horace Walpole, rocks up one day with a book that he claims was written in Italy, and it has a bright yellow cover on it, which means it was definitely a foreign book, because at the time all foreign literature was printed with a yellow cover when brought over to the UK, so you knew it was more scandalous. You knew it was going to be a good time. Horace Walpole rocked up, said that he had this book called The Castle of Otranto, which talks about an Italian castle that had a ghost haunting it and knights, etc. And it was all made up. He made up the whole thing. He then built himself a Gothic castle in Strawberry Hill, which is where I studied at university. It's a beautiful building. But Gothic fiction became this thing that was almost a renaissance for literature, but very specific stories, and kind of became the grandfather of so many great genres that we have today, such as science fiction, such as horror, such as historical fiction, ghost stories, supernatural, paranormal, even romance to a certain extent. Certainly the dark romance that's taking TikTok by storm. That all stems from Gothic fiction, and it stems essentially from this guy piggybacking on other stories and claiming this stuff was true when it wasn't. So that is a really quick TLDR in what Gothic fiction is. And the reason I'm rushing through what Gothic fiction is because I've got some great recommendations for you. These are entry-level, easy to read Gothic fiction books. Some of them are traditional classics and some of them are more modern adaptations, so that you can have a taste of what the genre is without actually having to do the degree that I did, studying Gothic fiction so intently that you have to also pick up super boring books as well. I'd hate that for you. I'd hate for you to have to pick up boring books. But if you would like a gentle, easy to sustain reading of Gothic fiction, I've got some great recommendations for you. I've also got a sore throat and chai. That's good. Anyway, this is Zach's mug that I've stolen because it's the only clean mug we've got. One of the first classics I want to talk about isn't actually from the Gothic period, but has a lot of Gothic tropes in it, and that is J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. This is about a family called the Burlings who have at some point all come across a young woman called Eva Smith and have all somehow done something terrible that has resulted in her death, and the inspector rocks up and basically holds them accountable, and it is whether the generations can learn their mistakes or not. Now this is very, very basic. Because it's a play, it's very easy to consume. If you can go and see it, even better. But the way it talks about accountability, the way it talks about classism is very Gothic. The way it talks about the upper and lower working classes, etc. is very Gothic. The isolation that certain characters feel, the trauma that they go through, the substance abuse they go through, that is all very, very Gothic. Gothic is not afraid to shine lights on really dark topics, such as trauma and self-sabotage and self-abuse, especially when it comes to substance abuse. Sherlock Holmes is another prime example of this, where it's a mystery novel that follows a man who has drug problems and he uses them to sustain certain behaviours, but that's a very, very Gothic trope. And what I really liked about this, there's hints to the fact that the inspector is also a figment of their imagination, or is an opportunity, almost like A Christmas Carol's Ghost of Christmas Past, an opportunity for them to rectify their mistakes. In the fact that his name is Inspector Ghoul, it then even throws back to the fact that he might be a ghost. It is very cleverly crafted, whilst also being very palatable. We teach this to teenagers, so if you are nervous or worried, this will make you look super smart because it's a proper classic, but it's also an easily digestible classic. Along the same theme of an easily digestible classic, I've got The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is the classic tale of a doctor who flew too close to the sun and creates this alter ego for himself. What's really interesting about this, one, super short. Super short. It is written, again, like a murder mystery. It is not written from either perspective of Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. It is actually written from the perspective of Mr. Utterson. And Mr. Utterson is a lawyer who works with Dr. Jekyll and he is essentially trying to work out what is happening to his friend. There are incredibly gay undertones in this as well, which again, Gothic fiction does not seem to shy away from. We love that. But obviously, going into this, you're going to know and have a better understanding of what the whole Jekyll and Hyde instance is before you read this. But before this had come out, no one knew what this was. No one had an understanding for someone who might have a secret identity. And the idea of having dual personalities or dual perspectives on something was very, very new. And it is one of my favourite Gothic novels, especially traditional Gothics. One, again, very palatable, very easy to understand. Two, super short. Three, very much leads into the whole science fiction and paranormal elements. It's in a very familiar setting because it's in London, and it really looks at the morality of man, which is a massive Gothic trope. My all-time favourite Gothic novel, though, is Dracula. I adore Dracula. This is a mixed media Gothic novel written as a collection of journal entries, newspaper clippings, and audio recordings from a variety of different characters. And it's essentially about a group of men who discover that this dark force has moved into their hometown and is killing the women that they love. And when I first read this, in my head, I was like, the first 11 chapters are exclusively Jonathan Harker talking about what he eats. And I was wrong. It's only the first 3 chapters. But after that, then the action kicks in. And again, this is a very easy, palatable, entry-level Gothic fiction, while still being a traditional Gothic. And obviously, once you've read Dracula, you are going to see all of the Dracula references in every vampire novel you read after that. Speaking of, I do have another classic Gothic that I want to talk about, but I want to talk about these 2 vampire novels first. These are both YA novels that are heavily influenced by Dracula in particular, because this is a Dracula retelling, and other vampire Gothics. The Deathless Girls is a BIPOC YA LGBT novel about the wives of Dracula. It is set in Romania. It has a very classical, traditional Romanian style writing to it. Kira Moore-Hargraves has such a beautiful style of writing, and I just feel like when you step into this book, you are stepping into Romania. You are stepping into the original Vlad the Impaler, which inspired Dracula's history, and I just love that. I love that it really immerses you in the isolation of being in the woods, but also how toxic it is to then take someone out of their society and force them into slavery, etc. Like, I feel like toxic is probably not the right word, but do you know what I mean? Like, that kind of trauma that comes with that is really clear. There is classic monster fighting scenes in this as well, but because it's YA, the pacing works really nicely. Whilst it is a nice, gentle, Gothic, slow pace, it still moves with the pacing of a YA. It still moves faster than usual. It's still more palatable than maybe a traditional classic. So I would recommend reading this, and if you need this as a warm-up to Dracula, I would completely understand. Equally, Amy McCaw's Mina and the Vampires. Mina is a straight reference from Dracula. Mina Harker is one of the main characters in Dracula, and she basically gets caught between the human world and vampires. And in this, so does our Mina. Mina in this has gone out to New Orleans to find her sister and hang out with her sister because her family is breaking up, etc. And she discovers that there are vampires in New Orleans that are killing people. And they kind of go on a mystery solving quest. There are 3 books in this series. I absolutely adore this series. Amy has such a fantastic understanding of vampires and vampire mythology, and it's just a really good time. But both of those are very easy, very palatable vampire novels that make entering into Gothic fiction a lot less intimidating. Now, as I said, Horace Walpole was a troll. Would my Gothic fiction lecturer kill me for saying so? Probably, but he was. He took this genre and he took the piss out of it, and he made money. He made money. And then Jane Austen was like, you've ruined young women. They're now obsessed with ghost stories. They're obsessed with the idea that this could happen to them. They could become tragic Gothic heroines running through the night, etc. It's addling their brains. Bless her, she was kind of like, you shouldn't watch too much TV, it'll ruin your eyes. She was one of those. She was a Karen. I'm sorry, Jane Austen fans, but I feel like in this instance, she definitely was. This is one of her later novels anyway, so I feel like that was kind of the point. So she wrote this novel about a young girl called Catherine Morland, who is incredibly naive, and literally that's like her opening description, is that she's not the prettiest, she's not the stupidest, but she is naive. And she goes out into London, or into Bath even, looking for a husband, discovers that this guy that she's attracted to is kind of caught up in this Gothic tale himself, And she makes it so much worse for herself and basically scuppers a potential really good match because she won't get out of her own head. So it is very much Jane Austen poking fun at Gothic tropes. So a great way to fully understand what a Gothic trope is to see how other people reflect and respond to it. And I feel like that is why Northanger Abbey has been such a prevalent Gothic novel. But it is just Jane Austen taking the piss. So there are some fantastic Gothic tropes in this. But if you're pretty familiar with classics, but you've just been avoiding Gothic fiction because it's convoluted and what have you, I completely understand, but this is also a really great way to enter yourself into just classic literature in general, because Jane Austen's writing style is very gentle in comparison to other writing styles of the time. Maybe that's because she's a woman, maybe that's because she was writing commercially, maybe it's because she's self-published, and we all know how well self-published books do to the mass market. At the end of the day, they're writing what it is they want to read and we're lapping it up. So Northanger Abbey, add it to your reading list. It literally doesn't get easier than a graphic novel to intro you into Gothic fiction. Through the Woods by Emma Carroll is a collection of 5 short stories that all have Gothic tropes. They are borderline horror and they are horrific in places, but again they lean into all of the tropes, and because it's in graphic novel, if you are more of a visual learner, if you prefer shorter reads, this works as a really great introduction to Gothic fiction because it ticks off tropes such as, again, isolation, monsters in the dark, fear, miscommunication elements, all sorts of different tropes. There are so many tropes. I really struggle to try and list them all, but isolation is the one that I've been reading a lot of books of recently, and that's why I keep coming back to it, because it is a really clear indicator when you've got this house in the middle of nowhere what kind of vibe we're going for. If there's a house in the middle of the woods or on a mountain surrounded by no one else, or if there's one woman surrounded by a bunch of men with more power than her, it's Gothic. That's what that is. So that's what this is, even though it's a modern collection of graphic stories. There is also, and this again is kind of more of a Gothic general thing, there are fairy tale retelling elements to this. And like I said, because Gothic fiction was one of the first genres, it has that kind of element of some of the stories that are retold do have fairy tale elements to them, because that is the kind of those are the kind of stories people were used to. Especially because general print was only relatively new. Prior to that, you could print stuff, but the volumes were massive and very, very expensive. This is when it got to a point where books were kind of palm-sized and more readily available to the masses, and therefore those fairy tales were familiar to people and therefore able to be more palatable when it came to a new genre. This has fairy tale elements to it, as well as those spooky Gothic vibes, horror vibes, monsters, ghosts, you name it. This is technically a sequel. This is a sequel to Every Heart a Doorway, but it is definitely more Gothic than the others. And I do feel like it is one of the few books in this series that can be read as a standalone, because it's technically a prequel. It is before certain characters end up where they end up. So you could read this as a separate thing, or you can read the whole series, but understand that when reading this, you are reading a Gothic novel. Again, you have references to Dracula and Frankenstein in this. Again, you have the dark, gloomy, everything is dead, boggy nature to everything. You have selling souls, you have eating corpses, you have all kinds of things. But the thing that I think is really interesting about this being a YA novel is the lyrical style of writing is very Gothic. That kind of almost poetic verse style writing is prevalent in this, but it's prevalent in Gothic fiction in general, because it drew from Romanticism, it drew from poetry, and it drew from like epics like Beowulf, as well as fairy tales, etc. So mixing all of those things into a genre, creating fantasy, this kind of ticks off all those as a way of experiencing that, but again in a far more palatable, younger version. So in this novel we follow a set of twins called Jack and Jill, who step through a door and end up in a kind of Frankenstein, Dracula, Gothic world, and they have to do whatever it is they need to survive, and they find their way, but when one of them starts doing horrendous things, they have to escape this world. They have to make a choice, and like I said, it is part of a wider series that includes doors and world jumping, etc. But I really like this, again, because it's a short one, as a very palatable, not intimidating entry-level Gothic. If you wanted to try Gothic fiction, but it's actually the spooky element that puts you off, I would recommend Chocolat by Joanne Harris. This is about a young woman and her daughter who arrive in a small French village and set up a chocolate shop. And it represents decadence, it represents luxury, and the people at first are not keen for her to be there. They are used to being looked down on by the rector and his church, which is a very grim Gothic style building, and him telling everyone that they're not allowed to have happiness, they're not allowed to experience joy. But because the chocolate shop is directly opposite the church, it starts to become apparent that there is a battle between the chocolate shop and the church when people step out of the church having confessed to their sins and then going in and experiencing luxury. There are witchy vibes. This is very much a good witch style novel in the fact that the main character, Vivienne, I believe her name's Vivienne? Oh, Vivienne, who is the chocolate shop owner, she is able to tell just from spending time with you, just by talking to you, what chocolate it is you want. And she gets it right almost every single time. And the rector gets more and more angry that people aren't as penitent as they used to be and that they are indulging in luxury. And that idea of kind of commonplace enjoyment versus the church, very Gothic. The idea that the church is going to come in and make everything sad again, very Gothic. And there are trigger warnings for domestic abuse in this. There is racism towards travellers as well. I believe they're referred to as gypsies in this, so again, beware of that. And there is an element of, there is arson in this as well, so just be careful with those triggers. But the way it's handled is very, very gentle. It's very, very gentle, and it ticks off almost cottagecore vibes, which is a very small subgenre of Gothic, and it's such a subgenre. It's almost like those two things could not be further apart, and yet they are intrinsically tied to each other. So if you're looking for a Gothic fiction novel that doesn't have those spooky elements, I would recommend Chocolat. But if you're looking for one that does have those spooky elements, I would recommend Horrid by Katrina Leno. This is about a young girl and her mother who return to Maine, which happens to be, or a village in Maine that happens to be the hometown of her mother after their father dies. And weird stuff starts to happen. There's sentient house tropes, which is very Gothic. There are ghosts. There's kind of prophecy vibe, like type stuff. But what I really, really liked about this is the dark twist that the heroine is not all she seems, and that what is happening within this house is not quite as it seems. And the dark twists and turns of the family and the familial history, very Gothic. If you think like Rebecca and the idea of those secret histories where people are hiding dark secrets that they are willing to straight up kill for, this has that, but with a YA pace, set in a school type setting. There's like a house party type thing, so there's all very familiar stuff, very easy pacing, very easy writing style. It is very Americanized, but I didn't mind it at all, and I think actually again very palatable at an entry level. And then if you're looking for more of a dark academia type Gothic, but the secret histories is just too big, I would recommend If We Were Villains by ML Rio. This is a Shakespearean themed dark academia about a bunch of students who are at a university exclusively studying Shakespeare and Shakespearean plays, and one of them is murdered. It then cuts to 10 years later, and Oliver, our main character, is talking about his experiences at the university and what actually happened on the day that he's being released. It's a really interesting, twisty dark academia, and again has all of those Gothic tropes without it being too convoluted. I will say that Lizzie absolutely guessed the end. I absolutely guessed the end. I didn't mind guessing the end because I felt like the mystery elements of this made it so that there was enough foreshadowing that I could work it out with the characters, as opposed to it being a rug pulled from under my legs kind of thing. So I really, really liked that, and I think it's a really interesting take on taking Shakespearean tropes and making them Gothic and making them dark academia. So there you have it. There are some entry-level Gothic fiction novels for you to try. I really hope you get more involved in Gothic fiction because I want to make more Gothic fiction themed content. Let me know in the comments down below, would you like an intermediate level Gothic fiction list? Ones that you read these, they were fun, but you want something a bit more challenging, or even an expert level Gothic where you're like, okay, those were intense, but I want to give them a go. Let me know in the comments down below. If you just want to let me know you were here, feel free to leave a little skull emoji. Treat yourself to something from Waypoint because it supports me in my content. Make sure to like, subscribe, and check out the links below because I have a Patreon now. And most importantly, have a nice day.